Hello everyone and welcome to one of our classes in our ongoing series on resistance. That includes our crisis preparedness, resistance medicine, herbalism for activism stuff. Before I proceed, I want to talk a little bit about who we are and then also give you all some content warnings so you can decide how you want to handle the class for yourself. So, we are an anarcho-socialist witchcraft collective called Sanctum of the Craft. You do not have to be a witch to make use of any of our content. Our witchcraft content is specifically adversarial against oppressive authority figures and oppressive authoritarianism. That's going to come across a lot in today's class. But we welcome all who welcome all, and we're intolerant of intolerance. So if that's how you feel, you're welcome to make use of any of our classes. Today, we are focusing on the mentality that people need to be in order to get through what activism demands of them. This is based in peer-reviewed studies and verifiable clinical research. It is entirely grounded on the current best understanding out of psychology and sociology. However, also the research of several neuroscientists. It has been reviewed by a mental health professional. I am not the mental health professional who reviewed this class because I am a clergy counselor, which is not the same thing as a licensed therapist. Therefore, this class should not be considered me attempting to diagnose or treat you because I legally cannot do that. I need to mention some content warnings. This class is talking about what helps someone get through a crisis, trauma, going through very difficult and hard things. The reason for that is because that's what we as mutual aid staffers, volunteers, activists, etc., people engaged in collective action are going to be dealing with. Whether you are going to be going to assist with climate crisis, or whether you're going to be acting as a street medic and helping either with the unhoused or protests, whether you're going to be running aid for people who are being oppressed and attacked by authoritarian regimes all over the world, it can be very traumatic. Because it can be very traumatic, we're teaching this class, but also this class comes with those aforementioned content warnings. We are going to discuss everything from suicidal ideation, non-suicidal self-harm, PTSD, acute stress disorder. This touches on abuse. This touches on basically what authoritarian regimes do to our brains and how that impacts how we handle stress. This is going to talk about the broken American education system, and it is in fact going to talk about the Holocaust at one point. So I really want you all to be gentle with yourselves. If you need to take a break, that's okay. If you need to stop attending and just leave, that's also okay. Any questions on that before I proceed forward? Okay, the last thing that I want to touch on is that this class is actually designed to work with one of our other classes. We taught a while back a class on how to deal with burnout and the development of CPTSD if you are doing climate crisis support. So, for example, if you are planning to help out during the next Helene or Great Wildfire or whichever comes next. And that talked a lot about resiliency, both amongst communities and individuals, and talked about the techniques that you can use to help you deal with that stress. This goes with it, it's complementary. There's a couple places where they overlap, but it is intended to be part of that. Not necessary. I mean, you can watch one without the other, that's fine. It's still useful, but I highly recommend that if you find this content useful, you go seek that one out as well. It was recorded, or the notes are available on our Patreon for free and public. They're not behind a paywall. So are the slides, so you can learn from it however you want to. Okay, let's get into the actual class instead of me just talking not about the class. So to start with, thick-skinned, tough, calloused, and hard. These terms are sometimes used to describe a person who is capable of doing hard things. That's the idea, right? To do hard things, you have to be a hard person. In order to be strong enough to endure difficult things, people are taught they need to be fearless, constrain their emotions, and hide all signs of vulnerability and struggle. Pejoratively, other terms are used to describe those who are perceived as not being able to overcome adversity or do difficult things, and these include being thin-skinned, weak, and soft. People are trained to push through difficult tasks without support, and if they fail or they collapsed, they're often judged in our culture rather than supported. Gender essentialism is a theory which attributes distinct biological and psychological qualities to perceived women and men. The language around being strong enough to do hard things is often quite gendered, with people being told to man up. These toxic traits are associated with the Western gender essentialist ideals of masculinity being praised, while toxic traits associated with the Western gender essentialist ideas of femininity are denigrated. Brute strength, anger that gets rebranded as somehow like not an emotion so long as it comes from someone perceived as a man, those things are praised, while someone perceived as a woman or feminine is denigration, where false confidence, bluster, and stoicism are associated with the strength to do difficult tasks. Our entire culture justifies abuse and bullying in school, sports, and the military that consists of insults, working people until they throw up or pass out, and driving people far past their boundaries. This has very real consequences in our culture, both in terms of how people take that stress out on those around them, and also on the fact that people can be bullied to death. People are abused and bullied until they start engaging in self-harm, non-suicidal self-injury, and even take their own lives. Children, teens, and adults die when pushed past their emotional, mental, and physical limits, including dropping due to heat stroke during sports practices, which is pretty common. Teens and adults in sports and the military are increasingly developing why can't I pronounce this word right now? Rhabdomyolysis, there we go, a condition where damaged muscle products leak into the bloodstream and damage the kidneys. It's caused by extreme exercise and pushing past reasonable levels of physical endurance. If any of you spend any time looking at some of the toxic areas of TikTok, you know that there is a growing movement for people to push themselves past their physical limits to the point where they are developing injuries. And it gets into some really scary parts of the manosphere, but is unfortunately growing amongst our youth, not shrinking. The hazing rituals at teen sports camps, college campuses, in professional sports, and in the military are supposedly designed to weed out the weak, but they cause psychological and physical harm, including deaths. The culture behind all of this is extremely authoritarian, with cis-male people in power perpetuating this culture, benefiting from carte blanche to abuse those that are seen as beneath them in a hierarchical power structure. Those abused in an authoritarian environment are less independent, more aggressive, more likely to engage in high-risk behaviors, more likely to develop psychological syndromes and disorders, more likely to use and abuse substances, and more likely to perpetuate that abuse when they are in a position of power over others. Ironically, the very methodology used to raise or train strong individuals actually raises and teaches very fragile individuals. How many of you have ever been around for a man tantrum? A mantrum? Right? Where the person has not been trained in any healthy ways of expressing the fact that they are upset and something isn't going their way, and so they just completely fall apart. And they express this often through outward rage at everything around them, because that's one of the only emotions they've been told that they are allowed to express. People who are trained to obey don't know what to do when the rules aren't clear. People who are constantly afraid don't make good decisions. People who are only succeeding in order to avoid abuse may not be able to motivate themselves to do hard things when the abuse is absent. People who are motivated only to please someone who is in charge of them struggle when the hard thing they need to do involves opposing the person who is in power over them. Authoritarian ideals of strength prioritize the external, abusive demands of those in power, including their threats of punishment, over a person having any sense of internal motivation, a sense of purpose, and self-mastery. The only master that we want is the mastery we have over ourselves. So let's talk about this concept of culling the weak. There is an idea in our culture perpetuated by some wildly misinterpreted and mythologized events in military and sports history from the 1940s and 1950s that the best way to make an unstoppable team that can accomplish difficult things in the face of severe adversity is to cull the weak or separate the wheat from the chaff. How many of you have watched a sports movie or a military movie that's all about like the couple of weeks of hell where they bring everybody out and they push them until people are vomiting and passing out and crying, and the ones who stick it out are the ones who succeed, right? Yeah. This is a mythological history. It turns out that this actually just breaks people, and the ones who stick around are really, really badly damaged, but that's okay because it's actually meant to feed like a cultic methodology. The people who end up being like, fuck this, I'm leaving, don't necessarily go on to fail elsewhere. The Junction Boys, the example that I give here at Texas A&M that's always used as an example of like how effective this is, some of the people who flunked out of those couple weeks of hell went on to be NFL stars. So it didn't exactly separate the chaff. Even if this model worked and trained a subset of any group to be elite protagonists able to overcome their antagonists, what does that mean for the rest of those who were separated out? Why are we okay with just failing out a subset of our population? Why is it acceptable in our culture that, say, 1/3 of people are trained and ready while 2/3 are failed out and left behind? Often those who succeed in trainings designed to weed out the weak aren't actually the people who are psychologically the strongest. They are those who have no other option. They may have nowhere else to go, no other support, and no other avenue to success, and so they endure through sheer desperation, rather than innate ability that is being identified and honed. This is one of many reasons why the military specifically recruits out of socioeconomic challenged areas and specifically seeks out those who come from disrupted home environments. If you doubt me, I dare you to go look at the CIA recruiting manuals that they have actually released into the public. They intentionally recruit out of broken home environments and socioeconomically challenged backgrounds because they want to build cultish loyalty, and you build cultish loyalty when someone has nowhere else to go. The cultish loyalty doesn't actually make anyone better able to endure stressful environments. The abusive training actually encourages dissociation. Dissociation is a psychological phenomenon referring to a disconnection between thoughts, feelings, memories, and/or identity. It is a defense mechanism that provides some temporary relief but impairs long-term well-being if not addressed. Dissociation can involve depersonalization, which is being detached from the self and personal identity, derealization, being detached from a sense of reality, and amnesia. It impacts a person's ability to think, to keep track of what's happening, and to choose conscious action. People who are dissociating react from instinct with less control over their actions. 96% of soldiers have reported that they experience dissociation in stressful situations. That is a staggering percentage. 65% report that they lost track of what was going on around them. That is an extremely high percentage of people who are held up as the epitome of the Western ideal of strength, who are not able to remain lucid during the sort of situations that they are supposedly trained specifically to be able to handle. The model of training that encourages and enables dissociative states focuses on having soldiers fall back on their instincts. Those instincts were influenced and programmed by military indoctrination. I'm going to stop here and share something I don't know if any of you know, but I am former military myself. When I criticize the military, believe me that I have my reasons. And during my Hell Week, I was told by my drill sergeants, we are going to break you. We are going to destroy you. We are going to break you down and then build you up in the image we want you in, where you will fall back on the instincts we've trained you to have. They know they're breaking people and sending them into dissociative states. They just are like, okay, that's fine. We'll just destroy who you are as a person so that when you fall into dissociation, you do what we trained you to do. Anyway. Let's see. I will note that since my time in the military, this got better. Even the military, the pinnacle of authoritarian gendered models of strength, has been shifting away from training methodologies focused on culling the weak that employ torturous techniques. Trainings now include a focus on psychological issues, including how to deal with hopelessness, how to improve personal resiliency, how to maintain the will to survive, and how to endure extreme stress that focuses on building confidence, optimism, and controlling hyper and hypoarousal, using positive self-talk, and trying to have post-traumatic growth. The military began focusing on stress inoculation-based training models that train people how to handle stress before dumping them into extremely stressful situations to see who would sink and who would swim. This model was found to be far more successful than the models that simply culled out those who wouldn't or couldn't take abuse. However, it should be noted that the current US Secretary of War has stated that he wants all of the changes to be reversed. He wants to go back to the original training model. He wants to go back to the failure-prone methodologies that resulted in traumatized soldiers unaware of what they're doing during battle. He said that the new model is making the military weak, and that he wants to go back to the model that had all the soldiers experiencing dissociative states and getting PTSD. Instead of throwing a person into difficult situations that break them, with some people breaking to unusabilities and others breaking into a usable cult member, training needs to focus on preparation for dealing with stress before throwing people into it. Let's talk about reacting from instinct, which these training programs insist is a positive thing. We're going to break people down so then they react from the instincts, retrain them into. The mentality taught by the programs in sports and the military that throws people into stress without training them on how to deal with it supposedly owns gut instincts. It then trains a specific gut instinct rooted in indoctrination and cultic thinking. Stress reduces cognitive bandwidth, which forces people to fall back into unconscious motivation. Cognitive bandwidth refers to our brain's capacity and our ability to pay attention, make good decisions, and actually stick with our plans. It correlates with intelligence and mental performance, ability to reason, impulse control, and success when control is needed. The more stress a brain is over, the more it relies on shortcuts. The term bandwidth refers to two broad and related components of mental function. The first is cognitive capacity, the psychological mechanism that allows a person to solve problems, retain information, engage in reasoning, and have fluid intelligence. This is the ability to think and to reason abstractly. The second is executive control, which allows a person to manage their other cognitive activity, which includes the ability to plan, to pay attention, to initiate, and also to inhibit our own actions. These are multifaceted. Scarcity and trauma impact both of them. The more someone struggles to meet their basic needs, the more their cognitive bandwidth is impacted. Resource exhaustion can look like being financially disadvantaged, sleep deprived, in acute or chronic pain, mal and undernourished, or stressed to the point of fatigue. How many of you have ever gone a day where you didn't sleep really well and then you didn't eat, and it just felt like your brain got foggier and foggier and foggier? That's resource exhaustion. Your cognitive bandwidth is actually being reduced by not having resources. One of the things I just want to stress for all people who are doing any kind of mutual aid work: no starvation diets. If you are going to be running aid, if you are going to be out at the protest, if you are going to be setting up camps outside detainment facilities, if you are going to be doing this work, you have to fuel your brain, because otherwise it starts making decisions for you that you don't know it's making. The more stressful and traumatizing a situation, the more a person's bandwidth is impacted. As people react to stress and their cognitive abilities are impacted, their brain becomes unintegrated. The unintegrated brain is fast, unconscious, reactive. It struggles with nuance, it acts on instincts, and it doesn't have a filter. You ever been really tired and then you just fucking snap at somebody? And you go, oh shit, that just came out. I don't know why that happened. That would be the unintegrated brain with no filter. It serves a purpose because it allows us to act first and think later. People often instinctively deintegrate when they feel they or someone else is about to be hurt. People need their quick instincts, but this kind of work requires that people integrate those instincts into the conscious, aware part of their brain and get a filter on them. The integrated brain is slower, it's more nuanced, it's more complex. It synthesizes information from different parts of the brain into a cohesive state, and it combines the instinctive and non-instinctive. We're going to be talking about the modular brain later and about how the multi-self model works, where you are intentionally integrating the different aspects of the self, getting them in alignment with something, but this is just starting to touch on it. A person's subcortical mind, their emotions and their feelings, reacts way faster than their neocortex does, their emotional regulation and ethical reasoning. Moreover, the neurons of the subcortical mind that provide input based on an individual's history have more influence over how they feel about their experience in the moment than the current stimulus being processed. That's a very fancy way of saying the subcortical brain relies more on previous experiences than what's actually happening to determine if something is dangerous or a threat or overwhelming. It will, and yeah, if it is acting without a filter, it's not necessarily reacting to what's happening in the moment. It's actually reacting to everything it's learned so far. So let's say that you grew up in the United States of America. You grew up in an authoritarian, abusive environment. You just did. It doesn't matter how supportive your family was. It doesn't matter whether you had a great friend group. It doesn't matter whether you grew up in an anarchist area. Our current regime is authoritarian and abusive. That has an influence on the subcortical mind that is ever present, omnipresent, even when you're trying to act on the moment and not the past. I hope this is making sense. Okay. The immediate reaction to a stimulus is going to be an emotional response based primarily on a person's history. The instinctive response isn't always bad. There are parts of the brain that are focused primarily on survival that just don't communicate with words. They may recognize patterns that the conscious mind doesn't perceive. Intuition can be honed to recognize certain patterns, and the conscious brain can be taught to witness instinctive responses to those patterns and choose when to act and how to act. Some people train themselves to act on the unintegrated emotions without having an understanding of their internal boundaries regarding what they consider to be acceptable behavior towards themselves and others. We've all met that person who's like, but it's just how I feel. It's just who I am as a person. I speak so honestly. I just don't have any filter. We've met that person, right? Maybe we are that person. Okay? But we've also met people who train themselves to suppress and ignore the reactive, instinctive parts of their brain, right? Maybe you're both. What day is it? Because sometimes I'm one and sometimes I'm the other. Neither of these is desirable for the mentality to do difficult tasks. More a continuum between the two, a spectrum that you can slide around on. The signs and symptoms of one's instincts trying to express something can be different from person to person. A person might feel nauseous, they might feel stiffness or tension, their skin might crawl, they might have goosebumps, their hair might stand on end, they may feel disquieted, discontented, cold, they might feel hot, they might have tremors, they might be shaky. Each person will need to work on interpreting their body's signals so that they know what their instincts are trying to tell them and when. It is important to listen to our instincts, and it's important to do it with self-compassion. It is important not to attack oneself for how one's body conveys their instincts. Those feelings should be interpreted as messages, as signals, rather than attacked and suppressed as a value judgment. Individual history influences a person's reactions to events, especially in stressful situations. The integrated brain is influenced by a person's knowledge. If that knowledge is heavily influenced by a toxic approach to strength, then when someone is stressed, their integrated brain will prioritize unhealthy methods of pushing through, which can then further deintegrate them. The more you lean into that authoritarian model, the worse it gets. I'm going to just touch really quickly on the kinds of knowledge integrated into the integrated brain. I'm going to note that we're going to get a little bit more into this later when we get into flow states versus clutch states, or what is referred to as an active state of gnosis. The first kind of knowledge I want to touch on we just discussed. It's apperceptional. These are perceptions and knowledge based on our personal experiences. You lived it, right? Therefore, it influences your ideas about the world. The second is epistemological. This is what people consider to be knowledge, what they think makes a fact true or justified, what they've learned, what they've been taught, what sources they rely on for information. For example, if a person thinks Fox News is a reliable source of news, then that would be an epistemological way that they understand the world, and it speaks to what they consider reliable sources of information, right? Then there's transcendental. This is what they believe to be true, their understanding of the world beyond sensory experiences and intellectual reasoning. I fundamentally believe that all people have intrinsic value, that all people are born equal, and they have a value that cannot be expressed by anything to do with where they're born, how much money their family has, what gender they are, etc. That is one of my transcendental pieces of belief, and it's pretty damn firm. So far, I've yet to encounter anything that shook it. But it's rooted, all of our transcendental beliefs are rooted in our apperceptional and epistemological beliefs, the things that we've experienced and the things we've been taught. All of this becomes a complex, dynamic, multidimensional system that makes up our knowing of the world, our gnosis, our active state of knowing, whether you're in a flow state or a clutch state, when we get into that later. And what gives us our sense of purpose and identity is rooted in this, and these things come together to make up what's referred to as our psychological floor. If you understand your psychological floor, you can start making changes to it. Okay, the first change we want to talk about is how to avoid triggering a threat response. During stress, as the brain unintegrates, that instinctive brain takes over. Sometimes this is good. Have you ever moved before a car hit you without knowing the car was about to hit you? Yeah, okay. Literally everybody's hand just went up. Okay. That is a great example of your instinctive brain moving you before your conscious brain recognizes. We need that, but we want to train better instincts. The amygdala is the brain's rapid response alarm system. It's responsible for recognizing threats and responding before conscious thought occurs. It may activate the brainstem, often referred to as the reptilian brain or the R complex, the oldest, deepest part of the human brain, responsible for primal survival functions and involuntary actions. You may feel this in your stomach. You may feel it in your gut. The reason for that is there's neurological tissue in your gut that is directly related to the response from the brainstem. This is something that is still being researched, so I didn't spend a lot of time on it. This is something that's still being explored and understood by neuroscientists, but there is actually neural tissue in the gut that is connected to the brainstem response. The brainstem can actually bypass the frontal cortex. The amygdala can bypass the frontal cortex, causing intense, involuntary emotional reactions. In fact, studies show that the prefrontal cortex largely stops communicating with the rest of the brain during this state. So basically, if you trigger that instinctive response, it can shut off the reasoning part of your brain. It can trigger the hypothalamus and cause a flood of adrenaline and cortisol as well. The amygdala learns and stores harmful and fearful stimulation to better predict future danger. The authoritarian, fear-based training prioritized in our culture programs the amygdala to take over. When individuals are subjected to long-term trauma or toxic stress, particularly in childhood, the structure of the amygdala enlarges and becomes wired much more efficiently to the rest of the brain, which allows it to take over the necessary tasks of protecting the individual that much more readily. There have been observed changes to amygdala structures and how rapidly and thoroughly it takes over the brain in children from abusive environments and people with PTSD. It actively changes how the brain works.
Can I just interject for a second?
Yes, of course.
There's a famous quote, "Everyone has a plan until they get hit in the face." It's quite literal. You get hit in the face, and your amygdala shuts down the part of your brain that has the capacity to plan.
Threats do this. And unfortunately, the authoritarian training methodologies actually make that worse. It doesn't teach you to deprioritize a threat. It teaches you to prioritize a threat. This whole the enemy team, that's not helping. When the amygdala and the brainstem hijack the response to stress, they can trigger hyperarousal, hypoarousal, or both. You may have heard of the fight or flight response, but there are other responses to stress as well, including freeze, fawn, fuck, I'm not kidding. Hyperarousal can be understood as an activation of the fight and flight response, preparing the body to survive by those means. Hypoarousal is often an activation of the freeze or the fawn response, which is often activated when the brain and body perceive tonic immobility as the most likely state to facilitate survival. So basically make yourself smaller or make yourself bigger. According to a study published in the Journal of Psychopharmacology, Dan Siegel's window of tolerance model of autonomic arousal suggests that there is a normal range of optimal autonomic arousal, in which people can largely tolerate their emotions and integrate experiences without becoming unintegrated. On either end of that window, that spectrum of autonomic function, are states of emotional dysregulation. These are hypoarousal and hyperarousal. Hyperarousal and hypoarousal are both dysregulated states, but on opposite sides of a spectrum. However, they're both triggered by this stress response, the amygdala activating, the brainstem activating. Hyperarousal is caused by an overactive sympathetic, this is the activation and arousal, nervous response. The symptoms include hypervigilance, fear, irritability, anger, anxiety, reactivity, racing thoughts, nightmares, flashbacks, high-risk behavior, trouble sleeping, being easily startled, tense muscles, fast heart rate, shallow, quick breathing, high blood pressure, high levels of cortisol, and high levels of adrenaline. Hypoarousal is due to an overactive parasympathetic nervous system. This is the rest and digest nervous response. The symptoms can include brain fog, fatigue, sleepiness, cravings for caffeine, alcohol, or drugs, trouble focusing, numbness or emptiness, dissociation, feelings of helplessness or hopelessness, shutting down emotionally, a depressed mood, irregular heartbeat, shallow and irregular breathing, disruption to the digestive system, and sensitivity to the cold. How many of you have ever been in the special hell of experiencing both of these at the same time? Yeah. Used to be that there was a myth that you could be in one or the other, right? That you could not possibly be in both at the same time. That is inaccurate. It has been pretty effectively proven that you can be experiencing both at the same time because both the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system can get activated at the same time. So you can have a smattering of symptoms across both of these. And you can also slide back and forth. At the beginning of the day, you can be in hyperarousal, and as you go into resource exhaustion, you might trigger hypoarousal and just go back and forth. The biological activation of the nervous system that leads to fear and aggression involves emotional, mental, and physical changes, which lead to an impairment of communication and problem-solving capabilities. The psychomotor agitation that precedes fear responses and aggressions lower insight into potential future consequences of actions and increase impulsivity. After a stressful situation is passed, there is often a post-crisis phase that veers more towards the hypoarousal end of the spectrum, with resource exhaustion, which can leave someone more vulnerable to dysregulated episodes in the future. So the more often it happens, the more often it happens.
This is a vicious spiral combined with a biofeedback loop.
Yep. Perceiving a stressful situation as a threat can cause a person's amygdala and brainstem to throw them into these dysregulated states. People who are more resilient often perceive stressful situations as challenges rather than threats. Authoritarian methodologies teach people to see stressful situations, the oppositional forces, and the authoritarian instructor teaching them all as threats, which leads to a greater frequency of dysregulation. A challenge is something that can be managed and overcome. A threat is something to survive. When you perceive a challenge as a threat, the brain goes into survival mode, which activates the amygdala and activates the brainstem. Training methodologies focused on integrating responses to stress rather than powering through in an unintegrated state focus on preparing people to meet a challenge. When a person can accurately assess a situation and determine how to respond to it from a honed set of skills, they're better able to respond. A person trained in a resilient assessment model acknowledges the reality of the challenge ahead and recognizes that they have the trained skills needed to manage and overcome it, and they feel confident in actually employing those skills. So if we know this, why do some people just give up? What is it about some people that just makes some people give up? Authoritarian regimes would say that some people give up because they're weak. They would label it as an individual failing rather than contextualizing it. Those in power over the systems we exist in eschew all responsibility for why some people give up, rather than recognizing the systemic power imbalances and abuse that are actually largely responsible. I want to note here that we just taught a class on non-suicidal self-injury and suicide and preventing them using resistance medicine. It goes into a lot more detail about the systemic reasons why people just give up and how we can address that as street medics. But it's parts of this, not the whole class, so I have to be brief. Rather than blaming people giving up entirely on the mental and emotional life of an individual, we must look at the patterns that cause someone to struggle, including political and social marginalization and oppression and the psychological toll of a person's individual circumstances. When living surrounded by death and despair, under authoritarian models that make success a matter of conformity to an abusive system, people struggle to thrive. This can be observed in war, in concentration camps, in prisoner of war camps, where people just give up. They become listless and eventually just shut off. But it can also be observed in schools, sports, the military, amongst the unhoused, in prisons, etc. Psychologist John Leach says that there are 5 stages to what he calls give-up-itis, which starts with general withdrawal, then apathy, then loss of emotional response, and a lack of response to any external stimulus. Motivation falters until even simple tasks seem impossible. This can eventually cause what is referred to as psychogenic death, a condition where death occurs without an obvious physical cause beyond the loss of the will to live. People's organs actually shut down for no physiologically identifiable cause because they just lose the will to live. The concern for most mutual aid volunteers, street medics, emergency responders, and activists isn't necessarily that they will die from this. But I want you to know that over time, if things continue as they are, we are likely to be dealing with this within the communities we support. Looking at ICE detainment facilities, looking at concentration camp structures, because that's what those are. This happens to those people. Looking at unhoused communities where they are having fewer and fewer resources and being targeted for violence more and more, this is what we're going to start seeing. Looking at families that can't leave their homes, that can't go to work, that can't feed their kids, this is what we are going to start seeing more and more of. That isn't me like making a dire prediction out of nowhere. I'm citing human history. Okay, so the concern isn't necessarily that we will just give up, although non-suicidal self-injury and suicide are a concern and have been observed in crisis responders, that we have increased risks. The feelings of apathy and despair are the most dangerous, the things that we don't want to give in to. So what causes some people to develop resilience against stress and others to feel so helpless against it? Let's talk about learned helplessness. When people, especially from a young age, feel as though they are trapped and just have to endure suffering, they sometimes learn to be helpless against it. This has been observed in animal trials and in sociological studies of people. Animals, including people, that learn they can act to escape pain and suffering and have it be successful will seek to do so again. But animals, including people, who are trained that there is no escape from pain and suffering, will later act as if there is nothing they can do to help themselves, even if there is an escape hatch that they could use to get away to safety. When animals, including people, feel as if they have no power and no control, they stop trying. They learn to endure it and resign themselves to it. Even if later a path to escaping pain and suffering opens to them, they may not be able to take it. This is what authoritarian models of control teach. It doesn't make strong people capable of enduring through suffering to win at the end. It teaches people to be helpless and despairing. Everyone goes through stressful situations, but some people give up against that stress, feeling hopeless and helpless against it. And that can worsen acute stress into something more chronic. Before we get into acute stress disorder and PTSD, I do want to flag the first portion of this class lays out the problem. we do in the second half of the class get into how to actually train yourself to deal with it. So, yeah. I just realized I didn't say that at the beginning of the class. We do actually get into the clinically verifiable methods of doing something about this within ourselves. Okay, let's talk about acute stress disorder. As we mentioned, some people have a wider window of tolerance naturally, while others develop one over time as they work to do so as part of developing their own resiliency. The available evidence is that the response most people have to trauma is to initially experience a range of what are considered PTSD symptoms, but recover in the following months without ever actually developing PTSD. Acute stress disorder is the term for an initial traumatic stress reaction following trauma. There is some debate as to whether the diagnosis is meant to identify people who are more likely to develop PTSD, or whether it describes a transient reaction that most people have in the initial 48 hours after a trauma. This is my opinion, by the way, is the second. Most people will present with acute stress disorder symptoms right after going through something really traumatic. That doesn't mean that most people develop PTSD. The vast majority of people don't. The ICD-10 describes acute stress reaction as a spectrum of anxious and depressive trauma responses that may or may not develop into PTSD. But the diagnosis of an acute stress reaction was moved to the ICD-11 section, factors influencing health status, because the reactions are considered normal and generally resolve, allowing a person to recover and return to their everyday life. The signs and symptoms of acute stress disorder are recurrent, involuntary, intrusive, distressive memories of a traumatic event. In children, this can look like repetitive play with the themes and aspects of the traumatic event occurring as themes in their play. Recurrent distressing dreams in which the content and or effect of the dream are related to the events. Note in children, these can be frightening dreams without recognizable content. Dissociative reactions, including flashbacks, in which the individual feels or acts as if the traumatic event were reoccurring. Such reactions may occur on a continuum, with the most extreme expression being a complete loss of awareness of present surroundings. In children, trauma-specific reenactment can occur, like flashbacks can happen during play. Intense or prolonged psychological distress or marked physiological reactions in response to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic event. Negativity, persistent inability to experience positive emotions, the inability to experience happiness, satisfaction, or loving feelings. Dissociation, avoidance, efforts to avoid distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings about or closely associated with the traumatic events. Efforts to avoid external reminders, people, places, conversations, activities, objects, and situations that arouse those distressing memories, thoughts, and feelings about or closely associated with the traumatic events. Hyperarousal and hypoarousal. The duration is generally 3 days to 1 month after being in a traumatic environment. If the symptoms persist for longer than 4 weeks, a person would likely be diagnosed as having PTSD. The reason many people who developed PTSD did not meet the criteria for ASD according to the DSM-4 is that they didn't have disassociation. That is one reason why disassociation is no longer required for a diagnosis of acute stress disorder. So who's actually more likely to transition from acute stress disorder to PTSD? It's difficult to know what a person's window of tolerance is. It's difficult to know when they're exhibiting the normal signs of stress during a disaster, a crisis, or a trauma, and when they're transitioning into ASD, and it's hard to predict who will be resilient and adapt and who will transition into having PTSD. There are a few signs that someone can watch for themselves and others. Persistent dissociation that goes on for weeks or months is a concern because it may indicate that someone is avoiding recognizing, accepting, and recovering from trauma that was noticed, recorded, and just isn't being integrated. Persistent dissociation is more predictive of ASD developing into PTSD than dissociation at all. So dissociation for the first couple days, pretty normal. Dissociation that goes on for months, generally a sign that something isn't being integrated and someone's shifting towards PTSD. People who catastrophize trauma they're going through are more likely to develop PTSD, especially those who present with symptoms of ASD and exaggerate the probability of the future being extremely negative. The more someone is like, I can't possibly ever recover from what I've been through, this is the worst thing ever, I cannot endure, the more likely they are to develop PTSD. Individuals who tend towards a freeze response, that hypoarousal tonic immobility during a traumatic experience, are more likely to develop depression and PTSD. This may be linked to feelings of shame or self-blame, that they are a person who freezes instead of fights because of our cultural emphasis that one is better than the other. People who tend to freeze up or fawn tend to be very hard on themselves about that. Taking personal responsibility for some kind of disaster or trauma and catastrophizing one's own role, like blaming the self, that tends to lean towards developing PTSD. Survivors of disaster, crisis, and trauma who exhibit the full syndrome of ASD are very much at a high risk of developing PTSD. And when people exhibit ASD with symptoms so pervasive that they do not allow the survivor to focus on positive experiences in the aftermath of trauma, that can be an indicator as well. PTSD. Those who are more at risk of developing post-traumatic stress disorder include people with previous childhood trauma, people with repeated traumas, people who tend towards disassociation already, people who present with the full syndrome of acute stress disorder, people who experience significant hyperarousal, including panic attacks during and shortly after a traumatic event, people who experienced a freeze response during a traumatic event, people who catastrophize, people who tell themselves the future is hopeless, people who exaggerate their own responsibility, people with anxiety disorders, people with depressive disorders, and people with substance use disorders. The symptoms include reliving the events with recurrent dreams, flashbacks, intrusive memories, unrest in situations that bring back memories of the original traumas, avoiding situations that are reminders of the events, so avoiding visual associations, smells, sounds, and physical surroundings similar to the traumatic event. Negative changes in beliefs and feelings, so this includes feelings of numbness, withdrawal from those around them, reduced interest in others and in the outside world, and hyperarousal, that constant watchfulness, irritability, jumpiness, being easily startled, outbursts of rage, and insomnia. Children experiencing PTSD may repetitively act out their trauma in play, and their symptoms, restlessness, fidgeting, difficulty with paying attention, can actually be mistaken for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which makes understanding that a child is in an abusive home sometimes difficult to recognize because it can just look like someone has ADHD. CPTSD. PTSD usually results from a single incident. Complex PTSD, by contrast, often results from either multiple forms of traumatic events happening to one person and/or sustained repeated traumatic events such as chronic sexual abuse, chronic intimate partner violence, human trafficking, war, and civil unrest. It is worthwhile to note that CPTSD is not included in the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual 5th edition, the DSM-5, which took a broader approach to the diagnosis of PTSD, but it is included in the International Classification of Diseases 11th edition, the ICD-11. CPTSD can happen to anyone exposed to repeated and/or long-term trauma, but it is more likely to occur when someone was hurt by a person that they should have been able to trust, like a parent, a caregiver, a guardian, a partner, a spouse, etc. So I want to ask you all a question here right now. Do you think that these kids are supposed to be able to trust their coaches? And these authoritarian methodologies of training people to deal with stress, do you think they're supposed to be able to trust them? What about if they're in martial arts? Do you think they should be able to trust their sensei or their sifu?
Ideally.
Ideally. What about a member of the clergy who's teaching people how to get through stressful things? Do you think they should be able to trust that person? Not can they in America, but should they be able to? Yes. Okay. So when we talk about developing CPTSD, if it's a person someone should be able to trust who is abusing them, there is more of a chance of developing CPTSD. So I want you all to think about what we've covered so far about authoritarian training to make people strong. What do you think the chances are that it's actually giving some of these people CPTSD?
I mean, 100% we know.
We know. We actually know this, that football players present not only with traumatic brain injuries, but also with the signs of CPTSD after going through standard football training.
So there's like the entirety of the military.
Yep, entirety of the military. Those at more risk of developing CPTSD are victims of repeat or long-term childhood trauma, victims of bullying and harassment, victims of stalking, victims of long-term physical or sexual abuse, victims of long-term intimate and domestic partner violence, victims of human or sex trafficking, victims of war, victims of genocide, and victims of frequent community violence. The signs and symptoms of PTSD are very similar to those of PTSD, but with additional issues with emotional regulation, identity, damaged sense of self, damaged sense of purpose, and ability to build and sustain healthy relationships. According to the ICD-11, complex PTSD includes most of the core symptoms of PTSD, including flashbacks, avoidance, detachment, excessive attention to the possibility of danger, that hypervigilance, frequent negative thoughts and emotions, but in addition, excessive reactivity to negative emotional stimuli with anger and aggressive behavior. This is called affective dysregulation. A negative sense of self involving persistent feelings of shame, guilt, failure, and worthlessness, and severe difficulty in forming and maintaining meaningful relationships. CPTSD. So many people that I work with in mutual aid, collective action, street medicine have CPTSD. I have it. Ian has it. Just the other day, we had someone yell at us that they could not possibly control their reactions to something that was going on because they had CPTSD. They did not take kindly to Ian being like, well, so do we. When we eschew our personal responsibility for our actions because of CPTSD, that actually makes it worse. I just want to note. Now, I also want to note that during that conversation, I did not behave my best either. And we are going to be talking about that when we get to the exercises later, because I went completely counter to everything I'm teaching today with how I handled that situation. And I want to talk about how I got there and use myself as an example of what not to do.
To be fair, you were told to do it by a mental health professional.
I was told to do the wrong thing by a mental health professional, but I still have personal responsibility. Okay.
Can sometimes be good.
Yeah, I want to share it because you should know that it can happen to anyone, even someone who's extensively done this training, and what I have to do to prevent doing it again in the future. So anyway, preventing give-up-itis and despair. Historians, psychiatrists, and sociologists have identified behaviors through traumatic and horrible circumstances, including war, famine, concentration camps, climate crisis, and have found that there are things people can do to prevent themselves from falling into the worst of PTSD symptoms, including give-up-itis and despair. These involve controlling what a person can, which is sometimes just themselves, normalizing what they're experiencing, defined in more detail in a little bit, and maintaining a sense of purpose. People need to not feel helpless. That learned helplessness is very, very damaging to preventing the worst of PTSD and CPTSD and gaining control over the self. They have to feel as though they can still make choices. When people feel that they still have some degree of control, they perceive their circumstances as less threatening and more able to be overcome as a challenge. Please note that we do not support an individualistic model of resiliency, with the onus being put entirely on the person to overcome adversity. Even though we support a community resiliency model and we teach classes on community resiliency, it is still important for a person to feel as though they have a level of autonomy and personal resiliency. In many authoritarian environments, people are treated as though they have a choice, but it's a kind of a lying choice. That choice that they're given in an authoritarian environment is endure or quit. Some people quit and escape an acutely abusive environment, such as the players that left the Junction Boys and still want to be sports stars elsewhere, while still staying in a chronically abusive environment because we all exist in one under an authoritarian regime. Others quit the acutely abusive environment and, due to having nowhere else to go, falter and go into worse circumstances than the original acute abuse. But this lying choice isn't really a choice. People are raised to feel that failure isn't acceptable, and so won't recognize that failure is a choice that they are allowed to make. Additionally, our society and culture lack a safety net when people choose to escape an abusive environment, whether that's a home, a school, a job, a sports team, the military, etc. A person may feel that the choice between endure or quit isn't actually a choice because they don't have any means of escape. They learn to be helpless to their circumstances, they relinquish their own power, and they learn to respond only to fear as motivation, which over time worsens their feelings of helplessness into a vicious cycle. One way to break this is with something called normalization. Normalization is the process by which the emotions, thoughts, experiences, and actions of a person are not pathologized, but instead understood to be a normal part of the expression of the healthy range of human emotion. Everybody struggles. Everybody fails. Everybody hurts. And yes, you can start singing the song at me. I don't care. Normalization rather than catastrophization claims that everyone is negatively impacted by stress and trauma. Normalization does not mean saying that abuse or trauma a person is experiencing is okay or normal, but that their response to it is okay or normal. Stress can cause anyone to experience some level of psychopathological symptoms, which are most often transient consequences of acute circumstances. Someone who has an ongoing mental health disorder may find that their symptoms are exacerbated and triggered by stress, which is also normal. People are more likely to resist feelings of helplessness and despair if they are not treated as if their response to a situation is abnormal. It's normal to feel helplessness. It's normal to feel despair. When we're told that it's not normal to feel those things, guess what gets worse? Helplessness and despair.
Oh, no, it's just me.
It's just me. I'm so alone. Anakin Skywalker, what? They are also more likely to recover internally from a crisis and a trauma if they think and believe that recovery is possible and that their responses to trauma and crisis are within the normal range given what they're experiencing. Normalization focuses on decatastrophizing mental and emotional crises, contextualizing traumatic events, improving a feeling of control and self-mastery, and reducing feelings of stigma and shame. Normalization to prevent learned helplessness and give-up-itis can also involve treating the reasonable response to stressful events as something that will not disrupt the person's idea of normal. Viktor Frankl, a noted psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor who survived Auschwitz, reported that another person imprisoned at Auschwitz told him that he could increase his chances of survival by doing two things: shaving and standing tall. These were choices that a person could make in a situation where most of their choices had been taken away from them. That restored not only a sense of self-control, but a sense of normalcy. So they got choice and normalcy. The daily ritual of normalcy can help a person normalize that everyone goes through adversity and that their responses are within the normal range, even in the face of enormous pain and suffering. Do you have a daily ritual that you do even when you're in the mountains setting up an aid camp? I have learned that I have to have instant coffee with me. Why do I need to have instant coffee with me even when I'm out in the mountains setting up an aid camp? Because my daily ritual is to have my coffee in the morning. If that got taken away from me, if I was in a concentration camp, I would have to pick another aspect of my daily ritual to maintain. Maybe that would be the deep breathing that I do at the same time as drinking my coffee, probably. But that maintains that sense of normalcy and control, choosing to still take those actions even when other choices are taken away. Okay, our next section deals with self-mastery and the techniques that you use to handle yourself in really stressful environment. So we're gonna get into self-mastery, we're gonna get into the modular brain, we're gonna get into why it's important to have a sense of purpose, and what has been established as effective for this. But before I do that, this is the second half of the class where we actually get into how. I thought we'd take a quick little break, see if there's any questions on or comments on the first half, and let people get some water. Okay, right on time, 1 hour in.
Shall I pause the recording?
Yeah, anything from chat? So there is a question from chat.
I think my main question with the first section is how neurodivergence affects the integrated and unintegrated brain.
It does. I'm gonna start there. It absolutely does impact it. With some neurodivergencies, for example, OCD, which I am diagnosed with, making it far more easy for someone to become unintegrated. So one of the things that's actually happening, for example, with OCD is a way overactive amygdala. Everything is treated as a threat. Long story short, but one of the people who basically wrote the book on this topic, the name of which escapes me right now, but it'll be in our bibliography as one of our primary sources, also has OCD, and was getting into the research specifically to understand why their prefrontal cortex just wasn't controlling them and why their amygdala was always controlling them, and found out the relationship with OCD there. Whereas there's some other neurodivergencies where the prefrontal cortex is far too active and the amygdala is actually impacted and reduced in functionality, which is something you see in empathy disorders where someone can't really empathize with someone else. The amygdala can dysfunction there. And I'm not talking about spiritual empathy. I'm talking about actual empathy disorders. Different thing. So it depends on which neurodivergency, but it does have an impact. If ever y'all want, we can work with the mental health professional who is a volunteer for Sanctum, and we can get into way more detail on each individual way that can be impacted. It's a little beyond the scope of this class, but I want to note that it is impactful. Did that answer the question?
There has been no follow-up.
Okay. Let me know if I need to go into more detail, but I will move on for now. So let's talk about self-mastery, beginning with self-confidence. The mentality for enduring through stress cannot rely on false bravado and hollow confidence. That's what the authoritarian model teaches. It teaches people to pretend at confidence they don't necessarily have. Have you ever heard the instruction, fake it till you make it? That's been pretty thoroughly debunked as not working. People may project a lot of strength, but if they are actually fragile, they crumble under stress. Resilient people acknowledge their weaknesses and don't lie to themselves about their capabilities, allowing them to assess their ability to respond to a challenge more accurately. It helps if the person accurately assesses their own abilities without horribly denigrating them, but also not expecting that they will suddenly gain experience they don't have or perform perfectly under pressure. The mentality acknowledges that something is going to be hard, but it also doesn't overblow it into a bigger threat than it will be. There's a balance between recognizing that a situation is going to be very challenging and exaggerating that. Our likelihood of accurately assessing how hard something will be is directly related to our cognitive bandwidth. In one study, researchers asked individuals to judge how steep a hill was. Most overwhelmingly overestimated its steepness, 20 to 30 degrees instead of the actual 5% grade that it was. But the group with experience running on hills accurately estimated its steepness. They were able to use their training to look at a challenge and accurately estimate how hard it would be. However, when exhausted and fatigued, those very same experienced runners also overestimated how steep the hill would be. It seemed like more of a challenge than it actually would be. If people are aware their cognitive bandwidth is reduced, they can inform their assessments with the fact that they may be estimating things to be more of a threat or more difficult than they actually are. My cognitive bandwidth right now is ridiculously low. Ian and I are going through a very, very triggering and very stressful period where we are frightened all the time. And that's on top of just sort of the general frightenedness of everything going on in our society. It is a personally damaging thing. So I need to know that I'm seeing things as threats that aren't threats to me. And I need to know that and estimate how I'm going to deal with challenges accordingly. The resilient approach also defines success differently. The abusive authoritarian model employed by some sports and military training focuses on success as winning or defeating an enemy. It's outcome focused. It has an external goal. Resilient people focus instead on internal progress, with improvement rather than success being the goal. They build confidence not by relying on winning every time, but on learning every time. How many of you have done martial arts? Okay. There's sort of two models to martial arts in the United States. One is what I refer to as a black belt mill, where they're very focused on just making someone advance through the ranks and getting as much money out of them as possible. And one of them is everything else. Everything else is still divided into kind of two main approaches, one of which focuses on winning, winning, winning. Combat, judo and jiu-jitsu, MMA, winning, 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 right? Whereas there's other models that focus more on learning, improvement of the self, being a better person rather than a better warrior. Being better at handling stress and strain rather than better at winning in a game, right? Guess which one I would recommend you focus on if you choose to pick up martial arts to help you improve your self-mastery.
Definitely winning every time.
Yeah, definitely winning every time. Yeah. Studies have found that when confidence is low, people suffer from faulty cognition, negative affect, lack of focus, indecisiveness, nervousness, unhappiness, timidness, withdrawal, isolation, anxiety, and despair. They respond to difficulties as threats, and their brain gets hijacked. But faking confidence is just as damaging as having low confidence. In the 1980s and 1990s, the US saw a wave of programs designed to build self-esteem based on the methodology of John Vasconcellos, I'm probably mispronouncing that name, and Neil Smeltzer, who posited that people turn to substance use, engage in criminal behavior, abuse their partners and children, and fall into poverty and become welfare dependent, not because of any kind of greater societal failure, but due to their own lack of self-esteem. They claimed that self-esteem was the social vaccine, but they didn't actually have any verifiable research to back up that claim. I'm not kidding, they had not a fucking stitch of it. They made it up. The individualistic model claimed that people could do anything if they just believed in themselves enough. This completely ignored the conditions that impact a person's success and mental health, which again include political and social marginalization and oppression, poverty, living in a rural area, being unhoused, being black or brown in a white supremacist society, being elderly in an ableist society, being on the LGBTQIA spectrum, being chronically and acutely ill, being a veteran, being a migrant, being an asylum seeker. It threw all of that out and just said, anyone can accomplish anything if they believe in themselves. Self-esteem is decontextualized from structural marginalization and oppression, which impact it. Confidence and a sense of inherent value and autonomy are extremely beneficial to overcoming stress, but striving for self-esteem without actually learning skills that benefit a sense of self-mastery and confidence doesn't work. It also doesn't come in isolation. Social connection and resilient communities are needed for individuals to build resiliency. If I never, ever again hear the phrase, nobody will love you until you love yourself, it will be too fucking soon, okay? No, you need a loving and supporting community to actually have learn to love yourself. It doesn't happen in isolation. And this idea that we can just have perfect self-esteem no matter what's going on at home or in our communities. Yeah, I'm sure that the kid who goes home and listens to gunshots outside their apartment building is gonna have just as good self-esteem as the person who goes horseback riding every afternoon. Anyway, a little bit of a rant. The build self-esteem model didn't actually replace the authoritarian model. It just put a mask on it. Instead of punishment, people were heaped with praise that they didn't feel was earned and taught to seek external praise and validation instead of internal satisfaction with having learned something. Star walls have been found to be really harmful. I just want you to know that thing that they made us all do as kids, where everybody got to earn their stars and show off their self-esteem in front of everybody that they had earned all their stars, that's actually been found to be really, really harmful. And it's just authoritarianism dressed up as something else. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I just want to note that. They're still taught to seek external praise and validation, and punishment becomes a withdrawal of praise while everyone else around them is still receiving it. You want to talk about the impact of neurodivergency? So many neurodivergent kids are left behind by this masked authoritarian model because all the not neurodivergent kids are earning heaps and heaps of praise, and the neurodivergent kid doesn't understand what they're doing wrong. If the praise is withdrawn, sense of value collapses. This teaches people to fit in, obey, and try to never make mistakes, because otherwise approval will be withdrawn. People are trained under both the openly authoritarian model that instructs people to never show weakness and the masked authoritarian model that claims that people should act as if they're capable of accomplishing anything they set their minds to, that doubt, weakness, and uncertainty are signs that a person is a failure, and that failure is both an identity, like you are a failure, you didn't fail, failure is your identity, you are a failure, and a disaster. Is that an explosion or a car backfiring?
I think a car.
I think a car.
But I mean, either way.
It's kind of an explosion, so.
We're all vibing out. I think we're okay.
Was that an explosion that we are,
concerned about? That's a better way of putting it. A large study on more than 12,000 people found that those who pretended at outward confidence that they did not feel was grounded in actual ability were far less effective at lasting through a challenge than those who had a secure sense of inner confidence. Actual confidence comes from learning, training, experiencing, and being permitted to make mistakes. We need to be able to feel like we can fail without being a failure. We've stressed learning and training several times. This is because true confidence is rooted in actually practicing and doing the work. When people know that they're prepared, they can build a feeling of secure confidence. It also comes from a secure sense of self. It is built on taking time to learn the self, including both strengths and weaknesses, and being open about them. The authoritarian models, both the really overtly authoritarian and the masked authoritarian model, tell you not to be open about your weaknesses. We had up here a minute ago a poster where someone listed all the positive things about themselves. That seems on the surface to be really good, right? But it turns out that if we only let people acknowledge the positive aspects of themselves and we tell them to never admit to the negative aspects of themselves, that actually damages their sense of confidence, not builds it, because they feel like they have to hide those. Right, moving on. It is important that a person's sense of self not inflate their perception of their own value and goodness to the point that someone can't be open and receptive to recognizing their flaws. There's a balance here. We've all met that person who's like, I'm perfect just the way I am. There's nothing wrong with me. I know that I have a temper. I know that I can be mean. I know that I can be selfish and nasty, but that's just who I am and I'm not going to change it, right? That's not what we're going for here. We're talking about being open and honest about our flaws as we continually seek to improve, not being like, well, this is just who I am, suck it up. Whether a person is still figuring out who they are or their identity is pretty fixed, masking themselves to avoid punishment or to avoid the retraction of praise causes them to perceive the external world as a threat and stress as a personal attack. The authoritarian models don't want a person to know themselves and be open about their faults and capabilities because that isn't vulnerable to external control. This doesn't mean that a person should reject external input on their behaviors. However, it's important that the input isn't prioritized over the internal world or compartmentalized. People who compartmentalize external input, compartmentalizing it into either good and thus validating inflated self-confidence, or bad and puncturing their sense of worth, struggle more when undertaking difficult tasks. People who evaluate the external perspective to determine how they feel about it and whether any part of it is valid before integrating an outside perspective into their internal sense of self tend to thrive in adverse circumstances. This is what Ian and I refer to as discernment, where you actually take the time to be like, okay, is this a person I want to listen to? Is this a person who I want to take the advice of? What is the source of what I'm hearing about myself? And do I want them to have the power to influence me? And what kind of input is it? Is it constructive input, or is it input just to break you down, make you more obedient, make you a better base of their hierarchical pyramid? So this is what we refer to as source and kind. What's the source of the input? What kind of input is it? And discerning whether you actually want to internalize it or not. Don't take criticism from people you wouldn't take advice from, is one way of putting this, which I'll steal from, I think, a Facebook post.
Note that this can get you into trouble if you work in a capitalist system.
Yeah, you may not want to like be overt that you're choosing not to listen to them. Okay. Don't suppress, acknowledge. Human perception is probabilistic. We covered that already, meaning it assesses what it perceives based on how likely it seems. The brain uses cues in the environment to guess what is happening based on prior experiences and expectations. It makes inferences. In order to save on processing power, the brain predicts what it already expects. People's feelings predicts what they think will come next based up more on what they've experienced in the past than on what they're experiencing in the present, as we covered. The neurons of the subcortical brain that provide input based on an individual's history have more influence over how they feel about their experiences in the moment than the current stimulus being processed. The immediate reaction to a stressful situation is to predict what will occur based on what has been previously experienced in the past, more than what a person is experiencing in the present. It is important for people to recognize that their feelings can mislead them and predict outcomes that would be threatening based more on previous experience than what is actually occurring. But that isn't done by ignoring or suppressing their feelings. Recognizing that feelings can lie doesn't mean ignore them. Instead, feelings need to be recognized and understood. The better people understand their emotions, the more accurate their interpretation is, the less likely they are to respond from a place of emotional distortion and dysregulation. A series of studies from Swansea University studied people who engage in non-suicidal self-injury and found that their study subjects lacked interoceptive understanding. Interoception is the sense of the body's internal state, including not only our hunger, our thirst, our fatigue, etc., but what specific sensations are attempting to communicate about the internal mental and emotional state. How a body signals anxiety, distress, fear, anger, etc. varies some from person to person. Those who were more likely to engage in non-suicidal self-injury had greater awareness that they were experiencing a feeling, but they couldn't interpret what those feelings meant. They self-harmed to resolve an interoceptive uncertainty, the inability to process and understand the signal sent by the body. That is something I want to know more about, the overlap with neurodivergence. We already know that neurodivergent people tend to self-harm more than their not neurodivergent counterparts, the neurotypical counterparts. And part of this is because they are also more likely to undergo bullying and abuse, and that often expresses itself in self-harm. But also, some neurodivergencies impact interoceptive ability, the ability to know what someone is feeling. They know that they're feeling, and the feelings are a lot, but being able to label it is often impacted by neurodivergence. Again, speaking from personal experience, I have not only OCD, but I am autistic. And that autism impacts my ability to sometimes interpret what I'm feeling. I know I'm feeling, but I can't always label it accurately. One that I really struggle with is hunger. Where I am like passing out and going, oh wait, hunger was back there a while ago and I didn't recognize it as hunger. This happened to me yesterday. I didn't understand my body was signaling hunger until like 3 o'clock in the morning when it was too late to get out of bed, and I accidentally had like 800 calories for the entire day. So guess how I felt this morning. So it happens, but that lack of interoceptive interpretation can really impact a person's tendency towards self-harm. Another study found that people who scored lower on personal resilience had lower interoceptive awareness under stress. Other studies performed on military special forces found that decreased awareness and responsiveness to interoceptive signals causes people to have lower resilience. They are also more likely to misunderstand their current bodily state and predict their future bodily state, causing them to miss signs that they need to address to remain functional through stressful situations. Studies have found that people who understand what their feelings are and what they were based on within them, what they are and what they're based on in them, are more likely to succeed and strive through stress, anxiety, and adversity. They understand their own emotions, and that help them to not only overcome potentially harmful instinctive responses, but actually overcome the challenges that they faced as well. A systemic review found the same. People who can pay attention to and accurately interpret their internal state are more likely to persevere through adversity, as well as more likely to respond appropriately to others and to stress during stressful situations. Feelings are messages. The messages may not always be accurate, but they should be read or interpreted. It may be uncomfortable for a person to confront their feelings. They may have to push through discomfort and go in layers to find the root of what they're feeling. Feelings can be understood as primary, the root feeling, or secondary, which can sometimes be an emotional response to the primary emotion itself. So for example, I often, as a secondary emotion, tend towards anger. My primary emotion beneath my anger is almost always fear. The thing that will trigger me to the greatest rage is if I am afraid for someone I love. And I skip right past any kind of cognitive processing and into just rage. This has been very difficult for me having a teenager who I'm constantly afraid for, because it makes it feel like I'm always angry about stuff that's happening to my teenager, when actually it's rooted in fear. My primary emotion is fear. I experience it as anger. I can label the anger, but I have to go looking for the fear that's at the root of it. And I can't actually conquer the anger without understanding the layer beneath it, the primary emotion that it's rooted in, which is fear. Does this make sense? Everyone following?
That was awesome.
Okay. More contextualized, thorough understandings are helpful when dealing with stress. So for example, the physical feelings associated with anger, rapid and pounding pulse, flushed face, clenched hands, can be interpreted as anger. The person can then not only try to find the source of that emotion, but also identify if anger is actually a thorough enough label. Are they angry, or are they resentful, enraged, hurt, afraid, etc., and then ask the very important question of why. Some psychologists have found that labeling emotions can help people feel more in control of them. It can also help to rephrase the emotional labeling in a more positive way, which does not mean gaslight yourself. This does not mean lying about the emotion. That's a form of repression. But instead using techniques aligned with cognitive reappraisal, which we're going to get into more later. Instead of I'm angry, the person can change the language to I am currently really angry, but I'm going to work on calming down. This can increase the feelings of control and choice that a person has without refusing to acknowledge what they're feeling. This is when I learned in anger therapy, and it was life-changing for me, was to say, I'm really angry and I need a minute to calm down. Instead of, I'm really angry, that second half has to come too, because it gives me a feeling of control. There's a thing I can do to take care of the anger. But again, feelings may not be accurate to what is happening. A person may not want to act on them. A person may want to act on them, but in a way that they control and that they choose. Feelings have to be regulated. Once interoception has been accurately interpreted, the person still needs to determine whether to give a feeling dedicated attention, or let that feeling pass over and through them, or utilize a feeling for some kind of motivation or drive. A study on pain at the University of Wisconsin recruited people who were experienced at Buddhist-style meditation to lie in a brain-scanning fMRI machine while a hot probe was placed on the skin to stimulate a predicted 7 or above on the pain scale of 1 to 10. The control group had no such training in Buddhist-style meditation. Both the meditating people and the control group felt the same pain. It was a 7 or above on the pain scale. But the control group rated it as nearly twice as unpleasant to experience as the people who were experienced in meditation. As the hot probe approached, the control group's amygdalas lit up, while those meditating had less of an amygdala response. Once the pain began, the meditators activated their insula, a part of the brain crucial for interoception and the hub of what's referred to as the salience network, which integrates sensory input with emotions to determine what deserves attention. They weren't ignoring the pain, which is one of the ideas that people have about people who learn to meditate. Oh, you just put yourself above it. You just put yourself beyond it. You just don't experience it anymore. That wasn't what they were doing. Instead, they were accepting the pain. The meditators described that they had less dwelling on the pain and a greater ability to fully embrace the feeling of pain, while also letting go of the appraisal of what pain meant to them. They effectively used internal cognitive reappraisal to influence areas of the brain and turn off their own threat response and go straight to acceptance and integration. The meditators found in other tests of how people with Buddhist-style meditation training responded to stress that they could, the researchers found in other tests of how the people with Buddhist-style meditation training responded to stress that they could also suppress their own cortisol levels and modulate their inflammatory response to stress, discomfort, and pain. Importantly, the research team found the meditators were not placing themselves beyond or above adversity. They weren't using distraction. They were not detaching themselves from reality. They were embracing reality. Being aware of and embracing something like pain seems counterintuitive for moving beyond it, but researchers from many fields have verified the efficacy of that approach. A research team from the University of Wisconsin found that when participants in a study were made to be afraid, being consciously aware that they were experiencing fear and acknowledging it as fear enhanced communication between the amygdala and prefrontal cortex. In the control group, the amygdala began its response to pain and stress before the pain and stress began, continued through the experience of pain and stress, and then continued after the experience as well. Effectively, in the control group that failed to embrace the pain, they suffered through it 3 times. They suffered through it as it was approaching in their anticipation of pain and in their anticipation causing fear. They suffered through the pain while it was happening, and then they lingered in it after it was gone, continuing to be afraid of the pain that had already stopped. This long stress reaction can be observed in those who worry about hard things to come and perceive them as threats before actually entering into the stressful environment, struggle all the way through the difficult circumstance, and then linger and obsess over it. This is referred to as affective inertia, the tendency of emotions to persist over time, which is closely linked to slow amygdala recovery from negative stimuli. The person continues perceiving a situation as harmful or a threat to them after it's already passed. People with affective inertia can learn to train their brain to confront, understand, and embrace adverse circumstances without ramping up to see them as worse as they are before they've even begun and without obsessing over them after. There was a text that was vital to me when I was younger that I have been struggling to find and put in our free library. If anybody has it, please send it to me. It was the CIA anti-torture manual that they actually made, they released it publicly. And I read it as many years ago, and it was ridiculously effective for me. I deal with multiple chronic pain conditions. I'm not going to detail them all right now, but I am a disabled person and I have multiple chronic pain conditions that are affecting me every day, some of which are considered some of the most painful things a person can experience. So when I talk about using this, I really mean that it was effective. The CIA anti-torture manual came out with information about this long before where we're seeing it coming out of psychology now, where it taught that you acknowledged pain as a message from the body. And as soon as you were like, all right, message received, I understand what you're trying to communicate, and you embraced it and accepted that you were in pain, the pain reduced, because it had communicated what it needed to. That's what I'm using all the time. However, it does have its detriments. If you're using it all the time, the way I am, I don't notice pain that I should notice as much as I should. I'm confronting it, I'm accepting it, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm in pain again. And then I wind up with a bone infection that's slowly killing me because I thought it was a toothache. So be aware that there's consequences for this. The modular mind. There are so many ways that people perceive their own minds. Some people have detailed internal dialogues with distinct voices. It's me. Some people have no voices in their minds at all, not even one distinct monologue, which blows my mind. Okay, so we have someone who experiences that. Some people are very visual, again, me. I can do the whole like picture an apple, rotate it, turn it around in my head, change its colors, all of it. Whereas some people cannot picture anything at all. Ian is aphantasic. Oh, there's another aphantasic person. Okay, Ian cannot picture anything in his head. And I'm just kind of like, wow, my head is constantly picturing things and talking to me. When I am frightened, I literally get a neon sign that flashes up warning, 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 with a sound that accompanies it that sounds like a siren. And I'm like, how do you know? Like,
It's the hamsters.
however, most people's brains have the same basic structures, with areas dedicated to specific tasks. These sections may or may not directly communicate, but they all influence the whole of what a person experiences. From the neurological tissue in the gut all the way up to the prefrontal cortex, we all have basically the same structure. It does get modified by traumatic brain injury, by neurodivergencies, by having an overdeveloped amygdala, but the same basic structure is throughout most people. These modular sections of the brain may agree with each other on some things and vehemently disagree on others. One part of the brain might be willing and ready to face an adversary, while the other part stresses self-protection and safety. One part of the brain may be flagging stress and lack of resources, while another part may be pushing forward, determined to hit a goal. I'm going to use an example that most people have experienced. You sit down to pick what you're going to eat for lunch, right? And some part of you is like, cake! I want cake. And the other part's like, we can't have cake. We have cake for lunch. We need to have something with like some protein and some vegetables. That debate, that's two different parts of your brain communicating with each other. That's two different parts of a modular brain communicating the desire of what to have for lunch, right? One part's going, cake is not a lunch food. And the other part's going, but cake is delicious. I want cake. So, not trying to judge cake or anything, just an example. These modular parts of the brain can be interpreted as inner selves. Note that no inner self or inner part is bad. They all serve a purpose, even if the ways they go about trying to serve that purpose are less than helpful for a person's larger goals and desires. I recently had a therapist be like, wait, you refer to one of the parts of yourself as your inner monster? That's pejorative. You shouldn't label it that way. And I was like, oh, I don't mean that as a pejorative thing. So there are areas of the brain dedicated to reasoning and planning, others dedicated to forming memory, others to processing emotion, and others to responding to stimuli instinctively. All of these have input on any action that a person takes. The inner selves or subcells all have input, but sometimes they take over, they hijack. When dysregulated, the unintegrated brain may allow one subself to take over and hijack decision making. There are certain aspects of myself that I don't let steer my actions. They are refused. They are not allowed to make decisions, but they still express themselves and I still acknowledge their messages because otherwise it will actually be easier for them to hijack and take over. That sounds counterintuitive, right? That if you acknowledge their messages, you would think that would make it easier for them to take over because you're listening to them. But failure to acknowledge them actually empowers them. Sometimes the subselves are integrated and a person is motivated to accomplish something with everything mostly in alignment to making that happen, with maybe the occasional flicker of rebellion from somewhere within. Sometimes the subselves are more deintegrated with internal debate and confrontation. Disagreeing aspects of the selves can be in conflict. The more stressful a situation is, the more likely that the inner selves will move to a confrontational communication with each other. The inner selves might be any of a range of different presentations. If a person does have an internal dialogue, they may express negative or positive things that are heard as thoughts, like distinct internal voices. Those voices can be supportive or they can attack. If a person does not have an inner dialogue, they may be mostly more feelings or impulses rather than thoughts that could be written out. One aspect may be very afraid, while another is excited, and you have these two dueling emotions. One might feel very down and despairing, while something else feels hopeful. And rather than a voice that says, we are despairing, it is the feeling of despair. Does that make sense? Okay. Wait, I just lost where I was in my notes. Sorry. Dialectical behavioral therapy, also called DBT, or other therapies focused on parts working such as the internal family systems, may help a person learn to communicate with the different aspects of the self in ways that can help them overcome adversity. Multiple studies have confirmed that how people talk to themselves during stress changes how they respond to that stress. Acknowledging negative, harmful aspects actually helps people manage them, very counter to the toxic positivity doctrines that instruct that negativity never be acknowledged, and the authoritarian models that insist people focus entirely on the goal with no room for doubt. Both the openly authoritarian model and the masked authoritarian model tell us not to acknowledge the harmful or negative voices inside of us. Don't acknowledge them. The self-esteem model is like only think good thoughts about yourself and only express good thoughts about yourself. And the openly authoritarian model is like only do what's strong, 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 win, focus on the goal. Neither of these permit an acknowledgement of anything negative or harmful going on inside ourselves. Self-mastery can involve learning Self-mastery can involve learning to shift from a confrontational interaction within to an integrated interaction within. Most of the time, people don't need all or even most of their selves to be integrated. It is perfectly normal and healthy to have the debate model going most of the time, for example, during what I talked about with choosing what to eat. That's perfectly normal most of the time. Multiple studies have found that that internal debate going back and forth as you decide what order to do things during your day, what to eat, how to approach a problem at work, that's normal and healthy. During stressful situations, when the selves tend to radically deintegrate and then come into conflict, is when it's helpful to try and get them more integrated and aligned with each other. The first begins with a dialogue, where the person seeks to acknowledge and understand what the aspects of the self are communicating and why. You can do this without a dialogue that you can actually hear with voices in your head, where you are essentially directing emotional communication at yourself. Does this make sense? Why do I keep losing my place right now? There we go. This doesn't mean giving into the aspects of the self, as the aspects of the self may push for unhelpful, harmful, or destructive things. The person can decide which aspects should be acknowledged and then allowed to slide away without giving further credence and power, and which aspects should be given more attention and control. Generally, a person has a main or forward version of themselves, or maybe a few that they rotate through depending upon who they are with and what circumstances they're in, like if they have a different primary self with family, friends, work colleagues, etc. And it's in kind of a negotiation with the other aspects. That version of the self can work to get the others integrated towards a goal. Unfortunately, this isn't as easy as a person just telling themselves, "We've got this." Positive self-talk only works when a person has actual confidence in themselves and their ability to get through what they're facing. Otherwise, positive self-talk is actually harmful. However, it is true that negative self-talk is pretty much always harmful to succeeding at difficult tasks. So-called distanced self-talk was very recommended for a few years in psychological circles. It's a technique for negotiating with the internal selves, basically creating space between the sense of self within and the situation. And the person was instructed to use third-person pronouns, their first name or you, to address themselves. So, for example, distant self-talk isn't, "I can do this." It's, "You can do this," directed at the self. The use of I, or the communication with all the selves as if they are part of the person, encourages a self-immersive perspective. And the idea was that a self-immersive perspective was harmful. However, recent research has found that while distant self-talk does reduce emotional reactivity, it also causes emotional detachment, numbness, and increased anxiety. It disrupts genuine emotional processing by treating the self as an object. This can also increase the odds of someone expressing negative self-talk, such as, "You idiot, you never do anything right, you're such a failure." It rapidly veers in that direction. I have a theory as to why this is, but I am, again, not that kind of mental health professional, so this is just my own personal theory. I think that distant self-talk basically puts us in the authoritarian role towards our inner selves, telling them what to do, commanding them as if they aren't ourself. And that doesn't work, just like any authoritarian control of the inner selves doesn't work. It is better for the main negotiating voice to focus not on being positive and ramped up all the time, but on being accurate and fair. The main self needs to understand the other selves and be self-compassionate and come to a just and fair conclusion that doesn't deny the input of the other selves, but rather is open to them and comes to a balanced, fair conclusion. So, for example, there's a part of me that gets very violent sometimes. And it'll be like, man, I really want to just break this neo-Nazi's jaw. It doesn't help me if I'm like, hey, you shut the fuck up. We're not doing that right now. That's not fair to that voice. That's not compassionate to that voice. I know why I want to punch a Nazi, right? But I have to instead be fair and self-compassionate. And that looks more like going, okay, I get why we want to break the neo-Nazi's jaw, but if we do that, we don't get to be at the rest of this protest to support our community. We're going to jail. Because of the two of us, I'm the one getting arrested if I just sock him in the jaw. So do I want that arrest on my record? Do I want to not be here to serve my community? Do I want to make it harder for me to serve my community in the future? No. So it's fair that we want to do that, but do we understand the reasons why we can't? And then that voice is like, okay, all right, as long as you acknowledge that I want to break the neo-Nazi's jaw. Do you see how that's a fair and self-compassionate way of dealing with it? Yes.
I'm just gonna say context matters.
Yes.
I'll leave it there.
Yes, there are times, but, right, where was I? The negotiating, fairly judging aspect of the self can then navigate the flare of emotion from the other aspects. As we have extensively explored, suppressing or fighting them doesn't work, and in fact strips a person of feeling in control. Instead, the steering aspect needs to accept and possibly reappraise. Acceptance refers to acknowledging the message, not internalizing it as truth. I understand there's parts of me that hate me. I accept that they exist, but I don't accept that they have a truthful perspective. You can accept the message without believing in it. We recently had a de-escalating attempt that didn't go very well, but we attempted it, where someone was very escalated and basically being like, you're not listening to me because you don't believe me. You can listen to a person and be compassionate towards them without agreeing with them. Have you ever had someone yell at you, you're not listening because you don't agree with me?
Mm-hmm.
Right? But you can listen to someone and genuinely understand that they believe and think the way they're expressing. They're not lying about what they believe and think, but you not agree with them. Direct that same ability internally, where you can go, I hear you, I understand what you're communicating, I just don't believe it. Okay. For example, one aspect of the self may be shouting threat about something or someone that isn't a threat. Acceptance doesn't mean the person should treat that thing or person as a threat, and so they should acknowledge the message as being received and then choose to either let it pass through them or reappraise it. So what's cognitive reappraisal? Cognitive reappraisal is a mental health strategy that involves changing one's perspective on an interpretation of something. This can be a negative or intrusive thought, a threat, a crisis, or a trauma, in order to reduce its impact. It is a form of emotional regulation that relies on confronting emotion and thoughts rather than suppressing and avoiding them. The process involves identifying and recognizing what triggered the difficult emotions, challenging the negative thoughts, finding an alternative perspective, and reinterpreting what is occurring as something that can be adapted to and overcome. Not only has research found it to be effective at helping build resiliency against trauma, but neuroimaging has also found that it activates areas of the brain associated with cognitive control and emotional regulation. One aspect of the self confronts the one that is triggered, acknowledges and accepts the message, and reframes it as a challenge to be overcome. Importantly, this cannot be done by gaslighting the self, which some poorly researched and written guides online seem to imply. Instead, cognitive reappraisal needs to be based in real possibilities. For example, if an aspect of the brain goes, "We can't do this, we can't do this," a cognitive reappraisal would go, "But what if we can? We can try. We can see how it goes. We're capable of overcoming challenges. We've done it before, so let's just try." Again, this internal communication needs to be done compassionately, non-judgmentally, and fairly. It can look like, "I get that we're afraid. I get it. We're afraid. We don't want to try. But the consequences of not trying are worse than trying and failing, so let's do this anyway." Respond instead of react. How to respond instead of react? Start with training with smaller scenarios. As we've already explored, people respond better to stressful circumstances if they've already trained in how to handle them. Resilience in the face of adversity is a learned skill. People need to practice it. It helps if they start with smaller, less extreme, less stressful situations. In the context of mutual aid work, street medicine, and climate crisis volunteering, this can include participating in less extreme, smaller events. For example, before a volunteer tries to go hike into a climate crisis impacted area, they can set up a base camp and tents for aid distribution and stay in that environment for a week. They can start by setting up an aid table for a day's event in a park. They can practice camping in the wilderness and slowly work their way up to being ready to tackle a very high stress situation and condition. It is important while working up from smaller to larger to actually make mistakes and have things go wrong. This doesn't mean a person needs to intentionally commit mistakes, but it does mean that when they inevitably happen, the person needs to acknowledge them and accept them as being part of the process of learning. This trains the brain to recognize mistakes during stressful circumstances as something that just happens and can be overcome and adapted to. Over time, the person can also practice letting their mind confront the less helpful aspects of the self while still working. While performing tasks, they can let their brain go into confrontational mode and explore how that works for them in a less pressured, intense environment, so that when they're in a pressured, intense environment and everything deintegrates and goes into confrontational mode, they have practice dealing with it. They can learn what methodologies work best for them to confront, accept, and either let thoughts, emotions, and impulses wash over them and through them, or reappraise them. So what are some different strategies that they can actually practice employing? Be in the experience. Stay engaged with it. Hone in on the interoceptive. The person can fully experience, accept, and understand what their body, feelings, and thoughts are attempting to communicate with them, and then select which to allow to pass through them, which to reappraise, which to act on and be motivated by. This has a high cost to cognitive bandwidth. When compared with techniques like distraction, it requires that a person have the cognitive capacity to explore within without being overwhelmed during the tasks that they are addressing. The next is to do the exact opposite. Break immersion without dissociation. Find something else to focus on. When a stressful situation is putting a great deal of stress and strain on a person, they may find that they can reduce that load by focusing on something else. For example, if someone is carrying an extremely heavy physical item and they hone in on the messages from their body too much, they go too interoceptive, that weight may actually feel heavier. They may focus only on the pain, the exhaustion, and the strain and fail to be able to carry the item. So instead, they can distract themselves. They can focus on the goal they need to reach carrying it, on the help they are receiving from someone else who's helping share the burden, on the steps they're taking, etc. Anything to not focus on the burden. They can hum a song to themselves. The same works for psychological tasks. The detriment of this methodology comes from not accepting the message for the body, emotions, and thoughts, which can actually make sensations more powerful. Some people first acknowledge the burden, the strain, and the pain, and then focus on distractions to avoid this particular pitfall. The next is narrow focus on the task, not the discomfort, so the distractions and stressors fall away. This is referred to as cognitive narrowing, which is effective temporarily when a task needs to be accomplished in adverse conditions without those adverse conditions impacting it getting done. Imagine a person setting up an aid tent in pouring rain. They may need to narrow their focus on getting that tent up, letting the sensations of the pouring rain and their exhaustion and their struggle pass over them and through them. This can only be done briefly because if zoomed in for too long, people miss their body and brain communicating with them and miss important external information. Staying narrowed for too long is detrimental. Don't narrow focus onto the negative or harmful emotions, sensations, and thoughts either, but instead specifically on the task. If you narrow focus down onto the negative, that leads to an emotional spiral. It's not good. So you focus on the task, not the negative emotion. I want to note here that if you have ever hyper-focused on a task to the point where you didn't eat or drink, and when you came out of that hyper-focus, you collapsed, that is the detriment of this methodology. If you've ever been hyper-focused on a task and you didn't hear someone come up behind you and try and offer you help, right? They're like, hey, I'm trying to help you. It's like you're not even hearing me. That's another detriment that happens from this. Broaden focus to resist cognitive narrowing. Again, we're going to flip and we're going to go to the opposite. A broad focus widens to take in a lot of information at once, searching for more input on problems and tasks, including creative ways to solve them. Building on the previous example, once the tent was up, the person could intentionally broaden their focus to take in the rest of the campsite, what needed to happen next, the input from others around them, and the input from their own body. They may realize they need to take a snack and water break, take a moment to breathe, and then search for where they can help next. Too much time spent in broad focus can also be detrimental. A person can spend too much time taking in everything at once and find that they are overwhelmed by it. They can focus on too many inputs at once and get distracted by so many problems and possible solutions that they can't focus on what to do next. They may get stuck reacting instead of acting. So, which one should you do if they all have positives and they all have negatives?
Context matters?
Yes! Thank you! Context matters, nuance matters. Learn to intentionally pick which one you use. People can and should note during their training and practicing what it feels like when they're using one method or the other to get through a difficult task. Stress can overwhelm a person, deintegrating them and pushing them to one pattern of thinking over another. They can take note of what's natural for them, how it benefits and harms them, and then experiment with choosing different approaches for different tasks. This allows a person to check in with their inner selves to accept messages, let negative and harmful thoughts and emotions and impulses pass over and through them, and reappraise as necessary, so they can refocus on what's going on while being a master of themselves rather than a victim of themselves. It allows a person to leave behind the interoceptive and focus on something after they've done that, setting their internal focus aside to take in outside perspectives and sensations. It allows a person to narrow down and focus on a task to get something done, even as stressful stressors build up around them. And it allows the person to then come up out of that task and reorient on everything else, ready to check back in with their own inner world and outer possibilities. The point is flexibility and adaptability. Studies on personal resilience have found that it is extremely important to be able to choose different strategies at different times, depending upon what works best in that moment. Every strategy for navigating stress, adversity, and trauma succeeds sometimes and fails sometimes. Every method listed here has benefits, and every single one of them has a cost. Even suppression, which we've detailed extensively is generally a bad idea, has a place in time where it is needed. Compartmentalization is a form of suppression that many people way overuse, putting feelings and thoughts in a box and then never opening that box. Things in that box fester, and they begin hurting the person, and then they overflow and blow up when things get stressful. However, things can be put into the box during extremely high-stress situations, such as life or death scenarios, and then very importantly, unboxed later, when there are the resources to dedicate to doing so. People have to train the ability to move between strategies. Some people may find that they're naturally able to do it, and some really struggle with it. But regardless of where you fall on the spectrum, it's our recommendation that you learn to know when you're in one and choose which one works in which circumstance. When things become extremely difficult, all people have one that they tend more towards than the others. It's important to know which that is. Okay. Gnosis and flow states. Actually, before I do that, I'm almost done. Only a couple more sections. Ooh, we're over time already.
No, it's still 8:30.
Oh, 8:30, right. Cool, we're right on time. I want to note that before I ever did the research for this class, I mean many decades, I started training under this person at the age of 11. I'm 40 now. So one of my primary teachers was a Holocaust survivor. And she taught me what I just ran through without ever using any of those terms for any of it. She used the analogy of a puzzle and said that you needed to be able to zoom in sometimes and really focus on an individual puzzle piece, and you needed to be able to zoom out and see the whole puzzle, and you needed to be able to hyper-focus on the puzzle sometimes, but you also needed to be able to pull out and look at what's happening around you and how much time had passed. And she talked really extensively about choosing which way you were approaching a problem based on what would best serve you at the time and maintain your ability to continue. And so finding out all this research as we were putting together the class was very validating, because that's been the technique I've used forever. Anyway, gnosis and flow states. All of this takes focus, concentration, and intent to shift. But what if it didn't? What if it didn't take a lot of attention to slide back and forth between those mechanisms? When people are asked about how they have performed at their best under extremely stressful circumstances, whether in the military, martial arts, other sports including dance, professional music, etc., some of them reference a state referred to as a flow state or a state of active gnosis. Do you remember us talking about the psychological floor? Okay, way back at the beginning, we talked about apperceptional, epistemological, and transcendental, and I said when all of those were working together and you were in a state where all of it came together, you could determine what your psychological floor was and how you handled stress. Sometimes all of those work together to create a state of active knowing. And active knowing is also referred to as a flow state. It should be noted that not every top performer has ever experienced it. They may employ more conscious, directed methodologies and strategies and still succeed in adverse circumstances and perform at their best. Flow states aren't necessary for you to be able to handle stress and trauma, but they happen to some people. Both conscious high-stress adaptivity and unconscious high-stress adaptivity require a perceived control and self-mastery, justified confidence in the self, and a feeling of drive and inner purpose. One is intentional and the other just happens. The term for the intentional one is sometimes referred to as a clutch state, which involves complete focus on what is occurring internally and externally with deliberate control and intense effort. So this is knowing all those different ways and picking very intentionally which one to be in at what time, and moving really rapidly between the different states to accomplish a goal. That's a clutch state. Importantly, often the intentional one comes first in training. And then one day, the conscious control to do it, to slide in and out of the different methods of handling stress, you just do it. It just happens. Many top performers in their field reference training to clutch states before they ever achieve a flow state. People who have experienced clutch states often refer to intense inner focus with cognitive narrowing. People who have experienced flow states often report breaking the immersion and cognitive broadening. Sometimes people report that to maintain a flow state, they need to get out of their own way. Most authoritarian models act as though they are training for a clutch state while unintentionally sabotaging the very tools, acceptance, reappraisal, etc., needed to enter and maintain one. Many Eastern, less authoritarian models train towards flow states by giving you all the tools to do a clutch state and then telling you to let it go, let it happen, and eventually you get there. Neither is good or bad, and both can help a person be resilient through adversity. Both require a strong sense of purpose. So what do we mean about a sense of purpose? Research has found that a strong sense of purpose may be the single most important factor in determining mental health outcomes following a serious trauma. One study of 259 individuals exposed to at least one severe traumatic event found that purpose in life was the key predictor of a trauma-exposed individual's ability to maintain a baseline mental health status and or recover from a psychiatric illness. A strong sense of purpose predating trauma exposure promoted resiliency, and regaining a sense of purpose was central to recovery. Mastery, a strong sense of control over one's life, was also significantly associated with recovered status. A sense of purpose was found to be more effective at preventing negative mental health outcomes after trauma than having a strong social network of support. So imagine having both. Wouldn't that be great? What if we had a bunch of people with a sense of purpose and self-mastery all working together to create resilient communities so you got both to help you get through trauma? When researchers have interviewed those who have succeeded in adversity, they found a connecting theme that they were not motivated by authoritarian pressure, fear, or even a promise of reward. They were motivated by their goal being in alignment with their sense of self and purpose. In situations where someone needs to oppose an authoritarian structure, authoritarian pressure as a motivation is detrimental. In situations that are extremely adverse, when fear is omnipresent, fear-based motivations falter. In situations where there may be no reward beyond having kept going, reward-based motivations falter. But a person's sense of purpose can endure. It is individual to them. We make a few recommendations as you are developing your internal sense of purpose. One, that it not depend on the action or inaction of others. We recommend that your sense of purpose not be, I will make people love me, because you don't control that. I will find an accepting community. You don't control that. That it not be tied to Western material success. I'm gonna be a successful singer. You don't know that, you don't control that. That is a combination of money, power, and luck that makes someone be very, very successful in singing. Okay? And happiness actually isn't a great goal either. I'm going to be happy as your sense of purpose. That's more of an accidental outcome that might happen as a result of being a resilient individual with a strong sense of purpose, but it probably shouldn't be your sense of purpose. I'm going to get to happiness, because then what if your house burns down? What if your partner dies? What if you lose a kid? Then your sense of purpose collapses because the happiness is gone. Instead, the purpose needs to involve building a sense of individual meaning, and you have to determine what that is. The inner sense of purpose can be what drives someone when they have energy and strength. When they don't have energy and strength, when their bandwidth is low, and when they are at their breaking point. After we get through this, I will share what mine is. I've talked about it before, and I'll talk about what happens when it fails, because mine did. So what happens when it fails? People who have endured through unimaginable adversity, including the Holocaust and other genocides and concentration camps, including prisoner of war camps, have sometimes described that at a certain point their sense of purpose gave out. If their sense of purpose was grounded in being able to learn, to teach, to create, then when everyone around them is being imprisoned, tortured, and killed, that can actually falter. It doesn't mean don't have one. Have a sense of purpose. It's very, very important to building resiliency, but it does sometimes falter. So what do you do then? Worst case scenario. The aforementioned psychologist Frankl talked about this, that it can give out. When the sense of purpose faltered and the will to continue living faded, many survivors of unimaginable tragedy turned to a different kind of purpose. Frankl referred to it as meaning in the minuscule portions of life and an internal freedom to explore. He found meaning in his suffering and believing in something greater than himself. Survivors often refer to pushing past the desire to just give up by finding a sense of meaning beyond individual purpose or belief in a specific religion. This universal purpose, the idea that there was something sacred to continue on experiencing, that experiencing is a kind of freedom and is worth living for, kept them going through the worst of everything. So I'm going to touch on this a little bit very quickly from a personal position, and then we'll, and then we'll do the exercises if we still have time. We have 10 minutes. Okay, so some of you know that I got out of the military and was unhoused for a while. And after I was unhoused, while in a very vulnerable place, I got into a domestic abuse situation, intimate partner violence, which involved both physical abuse and sexual abuse, and polyamory as mask for being shared in a sexually abusive fashion. And that this went on for more than 5 years. 7, I think we worked out the other day.
Sounds right.
During this time, my sense of purpose collapsed. I had one that was motivating me through all the previous adversity that I had endured. It motivated me through being a street medic, through training under my grandmother and her friends, through being part of the Black Bloc. Like, I had one, and it utterly collapsed. What rebuilt me first was the sense of greater purpose, not individual purpose, greater purpose. And I'm not talking in a religious sense. I'm not talking about a belief in God. I'm not talking that a belief that life was sacred. I fell back on something that one of my teachers had taught me, Mara, the Holocaust survivor, where she said that we are meant to experience. That, and this is gonna sound religious, but I don't mean it that way. She said that the universe experiences itself through us. And that was important and sacred, and that just us continuing to experience things was important, even if what we were experiencing was painful. And that brought me out of it, believing in that. And then I eventually rebuilt my sense of purpose beyond that. My sense of my sense of purpose, my guiding star, is to actually teach as many people as possible that they can break their chains and claim their own power and move forward in some kind of freedom. We talk about it in the purpose for Sanctum. As many people as possible might be just me. That's how I've done it, to say it doesn't depend on other people. if the only person I teach this to is me, I will have accomplished my sense of purpose. But who next? Who can I teach it to next? And who after that? And who after that? And who after that? That's mine. But if that falters, and it has, I fall back on my universal sense of purpose, that just experiencing is a kind of important or sacred act. And I will continue to experience, because that also lets me continue learning, which is very valuable to me. So that's mine. You don't have to share yours. I have some exercises that I'd intended us to get through. We've got 6 minutes. Let's see if we can do any of them. I do want to continue recording while we do this.
There's a question in the chat.
Yes.
Is helping others a healthy purpose, or is that too dependent on other people? I think a lot of mutual aid folks would say that is their purpose.
It kind of depends, and I'm aware that that's not a helpful answer. For some reason, the exercises are hiding from me.
They're in a different doc.
Yeah, I know. It's not coming up. Could you see if you could find it?
Yeah, while you answer that.
So, others may not let you help them, or you may be prevented from helping them. So, framing it as the other people have to be willing to accept your help, or you have to not be prevented, that doesn't work. Wanting to be the kind of person who helps others internalizes the drive as something you do control. Does that make sense? So this falls back on another thing we've talked about previously, about it's better to be a person who does good things than be a good person. We're all flawed. We all fuck up. We all mess up. We can't sort of sit back and be like, oh, well, I'm just a good person, so I can stop trying. We recommend instead a focus on doing good things. The same is here. Rather than my sense of purpose is I will help people, which you don't necessarily control. It's I will be the kind of person who seeks to help people when I can. Do you see the way that one depends on being permitted to help others and one depends on something you control internally?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so. Okay, exercise the first. Tell us something that a person raised in and believing this system, believing in these authoritarian system does when they encounter a difficulty that they can't just overpower. What's something that a person raised in and believing in the authoritarian models, both the masked one and the overt one, does when they encounter a difficulty they just can't overpower?
Get angry.
Get angry.
Trivialize it.
Trivialize it.
Walk away.
Yep, it doesn't even matter.
Just shut it down, all of it.
Yep, just power off. Can't handle it. Okay? Pick your example. What could they do instead if they allowed themselves to be vulnerable? You said get angry. What would they do instead?
Get sad.
Okay. Actually acknowledge that their anger is rooted in sadness.
Exactly.
Right? All right.
Yeah.
You said trivialize.
I said trivialize. Acknowledge that it was something that they didn't overcome, but that they can learn to in the future.
There you go. And yours, can you reframe it?
They could consider it. They can accept that it's something that's happening, and work from there.
Not living in denial of life.
This is an exercise you can do with yourself. When you realize that you have fallen back on the authoritarian model, because we were all raised in this culture, we're all influenced by it. Even if, like, I was born on an anarchist commune, I still got influenced by it. I got enrolled in public school at one point. Boy, was that detrimental. When we realize that we're responding based in the authoritarian model, where it's not okay to acknowledge negativity, it's not okay to experience fear and doubt, it's not okay to falter, it's not okay to fail, failing makes you a failure, you can go back to it and be like, okay, I don't want to respond that way. I do not want to give this system that much power over my internal world. What can I do instead? Reframe. Okay. Find a small thing you can control. So during a climate crisis event, a protest, a riot, right after a trauma, it can feel as though everything's spiraling out of control. Everything may seem too big and too much for any one person to face. They may feel as though they cannot possibly find anything to control under their circumstances. How can they have a feeling that they have any control? I want you to think of a stressful situation, right? And think of a tiny thing you can control. Not a big thing about you can't stop a riot. You're one person. What can you control? And give me an example of something you can control.
Juggling.
Well, you're going to struggle anyway.
Well, juggling.
Juggling. Oh, you could juggle.
I bring them with me everywhere I go.
That's amazing. Okay, that is probably one of the most unique and awesome answers I've ever gotten to this question.
Thanks.
I use breathing.
Breathing. Yep. You can decide to take some deep breaths. You can make the conscious choice to slow down your breathing. What about having a snack? A riot seems an odd place to duck down behind a car and grab a handful of salted nuts, but it's actually sometimes a really good idea to take a second and eat something and drink something. But you could also change your body position. That's a thing you can consciously choose to change. You can notice that you're doing this and unfold. Consciously choose to. One small change starts the I'm in control, I'm making choices, and re-engages the prefrontal cortex. But it does it when you acknowledge you are making a choice and taking back control. Okay? I'm not going to make you do this aloud. You can if you want to. Take power away from fear. Own a thing you are scared of about yourself, openly and proudly. I don't believe in doing the support circle model where you make people name a thing that they're ashamed of in themselves, because you might not be ready. But if you want to, you can. You can also go home and do so in the privacy of your own bedroom, in your bath later. Try and own one thing. I'll own one thing. I am afraid that I castigate myself to uselessness. I'm afraid of how much time I waste with self-flagellation. And I'm afraid that I will never learn to break that cycle. That I will always be waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning to do that to myself. That I will always catch myself doing it multiple times during the day and have to break the cycle consciously. That it will never be something that I overcome. That's one of mine. I've been really thinking about that lately. Shall I move on?
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on. Go to a deeper label of an emotion you've recently experienced. Okay? So you pick an emotion that you've recently felt and try to go one layer deeper. So recently, I was enraged, and I said at the end of class I would talk about this. I yelled at someone. Actually, I would say I roared at someone. We were in a very escalated environment, trying to talk about some conflicts that have been happening in the mutual aid environment. And this person spent the majority of the conversation very escalated and elevated, crying, shaking, moving like this. And I got elevated and escalated in response. And they said some things that were personally very triggers for me. But additionally, I tried to handle it using a technique that my new therapist wants me doing. My new therapist says I need to be doing the exposure therapy methodology of handling my OCD, which is hotly debated, by the way, just want to say. And that instead of doing these techniques that I've outlined during class, instead I just need to let the fear crash over me until it stops. Right? Don't confront it, accept it, acknowledge it, and let it pass away, but just let it crash and crash and crash until it stops. I have been trying this now for about 9 months. I have decided I'm done. This was the reason I decided I was done. And one of the reasons I've decided I'm done is that the fear doesn't ever stop crashing for me. I'm 9 months in. It took away the techniques that I use to handle when my fear turns to anger. I felt I was not going to be heard by this person or by the other person present, and that would have this cascading series of effects. And it just snapped. And they interrupted me one more time, and I roared, "I'm not done!" And then I went, "Shit!" And immediately was like, "I'm so sorry. I lost my temper. Let me regain that." And then I left. And I've apologized, and I let the safety team at Ruma know, because it is actually related to Ruma, and even offered to step away from Ruma for a time, and the person says they don't want me to. But that wasn't anger, was it? It was fear. Because for me, it's always fucking fear. I'm a fear-based organism, okay? So pick an emotion that you have been experiencing recently. Does it go a layer deeper? Can you go there? Can you acknowledge and name what it actually is? You don't have to do it aloud, but can you do it? I'm getting some nods.
Yes.
All right. Okay. Next step on that one. Can you reappraise it? So you got to the lower thing, right? I got to fear. I'm a fear-based organism. My reappraisal is, my fear got the best of me in that moment, and it caused me to hurt someone, maybe caused me to hurt a few people. I can try and do better in the future. I cannot let my fear turn to rage. I can control my fear before it turns to anger. Okay, that's a reappraisal. I can. I will try. Can you do that with the deeper emotion? Okay. Last one, because we're not going to try and have you figure out your sense of purpose.
Juggling.
We all have those different aspects of the self, right? Which one is the meanest to you all the time? Why is it doing that? Sometimes we need to understand why the message is coming from that aspect of the self in order to be able to either let it pass through and not give it more thought or reappraise it. So, for example, I've got that voice constantly telling me that I'm not worthy of love, right? And I know why it's doing that. Childhood trauma, the failure of people who should have loved and protected me and hurt me instead, the constant communication that I have to earn love, that I have to be correct, and my constant feeling of not being good enough for anyone, which is worsened by my OCD, right? I can say, I know where that voice comes from. And because I know its source, the next step is to determine its kind, right? Is this a useful thought to be having? Is this helping me? Is this supporting me, or is it just hurting me? So then my options are to let it pass through me or reappraise it, right? In my case, most of the time I let it pass through me unanswered, because that is just a constant crashing. But I can also be like, I don't actually have to be worthy of love. And I can go through the rest of my life with no one loving me and still lead a satisfactory life, with my purpose being what fulfills me. And that's good enough for me. I don't have to be loved. I don't need to earn it. And I don't need to be worthy of it. I don't control whether someone loves me or not. There's nothing I can control about whether someone experiences love for me or not. And I can live without it if I have to. That's my reappraising of it. So, where is it coming from? Its source. What kind is it? Informs your decision on whether you let it pass through you, whether you turn it into motivation, or whether you reappraise it. Okay? So you can pick the one that is meanest to you and be like, where the fuck does this come from?
Note that you may want to work with a mental health professional.
I highly recommend that you work with a mental health professional to do this. I, again, am a clergy counselor, and this is not intended as therapy. I said that at the beginning of class. Okay, those are the exercises. Is everyone good? We're 9 minutes over. That wasn't so bad. Everyone good with those exercises? Are there questions? Are there comments? Are there concerns? I got some thumbs up in person.
Fantastic stuff.
Waiting to hear from chat. While we wait to hear from chat, I will say, because this is getting posted on YouTube, please remember to like and subscribe. Go find us on Patreon. Our Patreon starts at $1 a month. That opens up to all of our witchcraft and herbalism content, but all of our stuff within this series, the crisis preparedness, the resistance medicine, herbalism for activism, that's not behind a paywall. It's on there for free. We never paywall any of this content. All of it's also up on our new website, sanctumofthecraft.org. Ian just launched our new website. We do really desperately need more monthly sustainers right now, so please find us on patreon.com/sanctumofthecraft, or at least go like and share our content so that more people can find us. And if you have questions or concerns, you can put them in the comments below, either on Patreon or on YouTube, or you can send them to us at staff@sanctumofthecraft.org. Again, that is staff@sanctumofthecraft.org.